A couple weeks ago, my sister, who runs the family's Etsy shop, and I were talking, and I was talking about buying some alum tanned leather to cut lace out of to put on the Etsy shop, and I got that blank stare that people give you when they don't have any idea what you're talking about. And it kind of occurred to me that if my sister doesn't know what I'm talking about, and she's fairly knowledgeable about leather because she's hung around me long enough to pick up enough to at least do Etsy descriptions, that most people aren't going to know what I'm talking about and why I would want alum tanned leather as opposed to vegetable tan or chrome tan, and what all these different leathers are. And that's just the tannages of the leather. Those are all cowhide. But anyway, so I figured I'd do a video I gathered some of the random sort of leathers I have laying around, and do a video on what all these different terms are and what all of this stuff is, and kind of a basic what these are good for. So I'll set this aside for a bit, get back to the alum tan later, and we'll talk about different tannages of leather. There's different ways of preserving hides. I use a lot of vegetable tan leather, and I mention it quite a bit. But there's also chrome tan leathers. There's the alum tan I was just talking about. There's different animals that it could come from. There's leathers that were just oiled. There's things that are actually even retans, which means that they might be partially chrome tanned and then partially vegetable tanned. And of course, then there's rawhide, and things that are called rawhide even when they're not. So it gets rather complicated because people have had something like 5,000 years to make this more complicated. But let's start off with one of the older processes. One of the older processes is vegetable tanned leather, and it uses the bark from trees and various other sources, natural sources of tannins, to produce a leather that you can wet down and tool and stamp in and make impressions in. It's very versatile. It can be molded and shaped. It's kind of stiff to start with. Usually. There's going to be some qualifiers in a lot of these things. It's from the tannins that are absorbed into it and the oils that they put in it during the process. So it actually takes the fibers of the leather that you can see on the side here. If you look very closely, you'll notice that there's kind of two different layers, or two major layers. There's the actual grain, which goes down a little bit into it. And then there's these coarser fibers that are underneath. And it takes those fibers and they swell up and plump up, and they're all hooked into each other. And that's what holds it all together. And since it swells up, it can make a very thick piece of leather. This is about 9-ounce pieces here. But it can be up to, I've seen 13 to 15-ounce skirting is pretty regular. So almost 1/4 of an inch thick. I've heard of and have run into people that you have worked with leathers that were up over 20 ounces thick on certain parts of the hide, not the entire hide being the same. So it's possible that this can be a very thick leather and very versatile leather. And it's been around quite a long time. There's mentions of it in Egyptian tombs, things that were found in Egyptian tombs, and so on. Various cultures have come up with different recipes for making it. And it can be a lot of different things. You can take vegetable tan leather, split it thinner from the thick hide that it is. You can use from different hides. Different animals are going to have different thicknesses. And then there's a process called milling, where they actually basically tumble it around and roll it and soften it up. And so, like, this piece has been milled and finished. It's been dyed of this brown color, and then a finish coat was put on the surface of it. But it's a vegetable tan leather, very similar to this one. It's just been processed a little bit different and finished further down the line. So this is technically an unfinished product. This is also a vegetable tan leather. And this has properties more like what you would associate with an upholstery leather. It's very soft. It's been milled quite a bit and oiled quite a bit to soften it up and make it nice and flexible. This is an entire hide of leather that you can bend and fold just like you would an upholstery leather. But it is a vegetable tan leather. So the stiff properties of it, not necessarily a given, but something you will notice with it is that it does have that different fiber that I was talking about. Even when it's been milled down, they're kind of more of a plumped up fiber to them. Toss that out of the way. Which brings us up to another really common type of leather that you run into a lot, and that would be chrome tan leathers. When people think of leather, they're generally going to think of leather jackets and purses and upholstery. And since I think sometime in the late 1800s, leather jackets and upholstery and things like that were made out of leather that is chrome tanned. And it's a process using chromium sulfate salts. It only takes about a day to preserve the hide, whereas vegetable tan leather can take months. So it's very economical for tanneries to do, except for the waste stream. They have to treat the water for the waste stream very carefully and gather as much of that chromium salt back out of it as they can to recycle. But it produces a leather that, on the back of this is a chrome shearling. It's sheep shearling is sheep hide that's been cut to be an even thickness. But you can see that this is kind of a gray, kind of a blue-gray color. When it's first tanned, when it's wet, they call it wet blue because it actually has kind of a really bluish, light blue, sort of grayish color. And that would be the natural color of chrome tanned leather. And sometimes when you cut a piece, you'll see the interior of that piece will be that gray color. And that's a hallmark of chrome tanning and chrome tan leathers. But they'll all often be dyed and finished to start with. It's pretty unusual to find a piece of chrome tan that is unfinished in some way. Mostly that's done at the tanneries. But they'll mostly be milled. They'll be fairly thin. They don't plump up to be as thick as the vegetable tan leathers. And they have, when they're thin, they have a lot of strength in that grain surface. So they're pretty good leathers for exactly what they get used for. Thin, flexible things like upholstery and garments and so on. Bags and purses and whatever. And it could be pretty easy for somebody to say, oh, well, these are basically the same thing. But again, they're both cowhide. They've been processed completely differently. This is a vegetable tan that's been dyed and finished. And this is a chrome tan that's been dyed and finished. And they do have different properties, but they're both leathers. And the qualifier that I had with vegetable tan about them usually being something is true also with chrome tan leathers. In that you can have a chrome tan leather like this one that is very stiff because it hasn't been milled and it hasn't been processed and finished as much the same way. This one has a little bit of a color to it. It's kind of a buff color. They've got a real velvety, soft back to them. Like I said, those fibers are different than they are on the vegetable tan. The vegetable tan, they plump up a little bit more, so they're a little bit coarser fibers. Whereas on the chrome tan, they're a real soft, velvety, and they break down into that softer texture. But that's all part of the processing to make it the way it is. Some other examples of chrome tan that commonly I see. You can have chrome tans that they have taken and made oily. They've either oiled them and waxed them and made them, again, they're still somewhat flexible. They're used a lot in things that are going to be rough use, like boots. You'll see chrome tan leathers often used that are oiled like this, like work boots. You'll see aprons and things like that that are made with chrome tan leathers that are oiled and waxed. And And in this, that's where leatherworkers start to refer to things by the hand of the leather. And when they say hand, they mean what it feels like. So if you pick up a piece and it feels dry, you might say that it was a dry hand. Or if it feels oily, that it's an oily hand. Or if it feels like it's got a coating of wax on it, it's got a waxy hand. And that just refers to what it feels like. They'll also say a soft hand or a firm hand to it, depending on what it is. Like this chrome tan piece is a very firm hand. This one has an oily hand. So that's what leatherworkers are talking about when they talk about the hand of the leather. Just what it feels like in their hand. I've got another example of chrome tanning. And this is one that you will see sometimes in other things. This is a deer skin. Deer a lot of times will be chrome tanned. Though sometimes you'll find somebody that is doing a much more primitive process they refer to as brain tanning, but it can involve the brains of the animal. That's the tradition, but it can also just be an emulsion of oils. It's just really a method of softening the hide and oiling it to keep the leather preserved. And then a lot of times it would be smoked. And when they smoke the hide, that actually will give it the color. And this is actually made to look like a smoked hide, even though it's a chrome tanned and then dyed and finished. But it'll give it some color, and it also has some formaldehyde and things like that that are given off in the smoke. And that's what really actually preserves the hide and tans it, is when they smoke it. The oils and such just keep it alive feeling. They keep it soft so that that smoke can then get in there and change the chemistry of the fibers. So it's very much a similar sort of what they refer to now as chrome-free leathers, or FOC, free of chromium leathers, will be processed with aldehydes and things like that that will chemically change the fibers in it. But that's just a more refined and scientific method of what was done as brain tanning in a lot of ways. Now that the deer skin's out of the way, I've got another little piece here. This is also chrome tan, though it could be vegetable tan. And if you look, you can see on this one, if the light hits it just right, you can see the hair follicles are pretty far apart, leaving little dots. You can see them on the back pretty easily. This is a pigskin. Pigskin is, when it's a thin leather, a pretty durable leather. Even in vegetable tan or chrome tan. And I use it a lot for interiors in wallets. I use it for lining pieces when I don't want to add a lot of bulk to it. It's a fairly useful leather to have around. But again, like I said, it comes in chrome and veg tan, and I've seen it in that chrome-free tanning. I've seen suedes and smooth full grain leathers like this. I've seen embossed patterns in it where it has a texture put into it. All in all, it's kind of a useful leather for exactly that, interiors and lining and so on. The only case I can think of it being used on the exterior of something is that thicker pigskins were originally used for footballs. May or may not still be true. I think most of them are cowhide now. So, other things on the table. When I brought out the chrome shearling earlier, I also have this piece of shearling, which is this bizarre orange color, which is, as near as I can gather, traditional, but not necessary. This is actually what's referred to as a bark tanned shearling. Bark tanned is just another way of saying vegetable tanned, because they're using the bark of trees for the source of tannins, just like with vegetable tanning, to produce this sheepskin. And again, you'll notice that it's a little bit thicker leather than what the chrome usually winds up as. Almost twice as thick. And that's again because the tanning process bulks it up a little bit more. This will often be used on saddles and horse tack and things like that as padding underneath where it's going to be in contact with the horse, because, well, no one wants to be on a horse when they're unhappy about what they had put on them, because you probably won't be on that horse for very long. I keep scraps like this because I use them often for applying dyes and finishes and so on. So sometimes these are scraps from things that I've made, or like the case of the chrome shearling, I just got a bag of scraps at one point that I use occasionally for a product, but mostly for dyes and finishes. And you can see that it produces a soft leather. Now these could also be alum tanned. Again, we'll get to alum tanning in a second. What I have here is a leather referred to as latigo. Now it looks like a vegetable tan leather in a lot of ways. It's got the thicker, bulkier. They're usually oiled and waxed, so they're usually referred to as having that waxy hand, almost a rubbery feeling. Latigos are an interesting example of something that's not just one tanning process. They're what's called retans. So you could wind up with, like they start off with a chrome tanning process and do the hide pretty much with chrome tanning, and then they throw it for a month or two into a vegetable tanning process. And that bulks it back up, thickens it up, they pull it out, they rub it down with the oils, which is called currying, and then they'll actually they'll keep it warm and rub in oils and waxes, which is called stuffing the leather. And particularly a lot of times it's called hot stuffing if they keep it hot and keep it warm. And that soaks in these waxes and waterproofs the whole thing. It's a process used a lot of times on hides that they want to waterproof to make, either preserve them in some way, or for like this harness leather, things that are going to be outdoors a lot and need the protection from the elements. You don't want them to soak up water anymore. Latigo will sometimes be referred to as rawhide, which is definitely a misnomer. But latigo is kind of a classification of leather that could be a catch-all category in a lot of ways, because like this one, chrome and then vegetable tanning, but it could also be alum tanning and vegetable tanning, or just alum tanning and then being hot stuffed. I've seen vegetable tan that's been hot stuffed that's referred to as latigos. Usually not. Usually it is a retan. Usually if it's just a vegetable tan, they refer to it as a harness leather. Now I mentioned rawhide, which is what this here is. And you'll notice it's not very thick. It's actually fairly thin. When you soak this in water for about 10 minutes or so, it'll get thicker. It plumps up a little bit. And it actually gets flexible. Right now, it feels like plastic. If somebody mistook this, especially if I dyed it black and they mistook this for a piece of rough-looking kydex, I would understand that. It has that sort of feel to it. Rawhide is not leather. Rawhide is the skin of the animal that's had the hair removed from it. And then it's been just stretched out and left to dry. There is no actual preservation here. If I left this in water to soak and absorb the water that it could and become flexible again, it's like it just came off of the animal. And if you left it wet and didn't dry it back out, it would rot. So when people refer to a latigo or an India tan, which is another name for alum tanning, as rawhide, it kind of drives some leather workers a little nuts because it is a different material that has not been preserved. But again, there's a reason why with alum tanning. So we're getting into that alum tanning that I keep talking about, that my sister didn't know what I was talking about. Alum tanning is used a lot of times on thinner hides, but it can be used on cowhide to make a thicker leather. But I've seen snake skins and fish skins and things like that, rabbit skins, a lot of times being alum tanned. I've seen sheep skins that were alum tanned, and deer hides, especially with the hair on. like a reindeer hide with the hair on. Now this piece here, this is a stingray skin. I mentioned fish skins. Something like this will often be alum tanned. And they refer to it as tanned, but some people will argue that it's not. They'll argue that the alum tanning process, this one was dyed black afterwards. A lot of times it will leave things white, just a real bright, stark white. Or in the case of cowhide, it leaves it, when it's thicker, it leaves it kind of a yellowish color. But it makes a very dense hide that's very strong, even when it's very thin. The only problem with it is that if you left that get wet all the time, you could actually technically wash the alum out. And it's just a naturally occurring salt. It's soluble in water. The water could technically wash it out. So a lot of times alum tan things like this, they'll either be something that has a surface on it, like I said, like snakeskin, or stingray has these little pebbles on them that are as hard as the enamel on teeth. It's basically the same material. But in the case of like a cowhide, they'll usually wax it or oil it to protect it from water so that the alum can't be washed out. So we'll get back to our little example I had here. And when I talked about fibers earlier in the leather, and the vegetable tan having big plumped up fibers and the chrome tan having smaller, softer fibers, alum tanning makes a very dense fiber in it. Not sure if I'll ever get this camera to focus on exactly what I'm talking about here. But you'll see this yellow strip that runs through it. The dye doesn't really penetrate a lot of times into it. It won't be struck through a lot of times like you'll have in vegetable tan leathers or latigos that are of good quality. A lot of times alum tanning, you'll see that yellow all the way through. Sometimes they don't even dye it. Sometimes they leave it what they actually referred to as that tan, and it'll be sort of a goldenish yellow color, and it's just kind of the natural color that it becomes. Again, like I said, I've seen these referred to as Indian tanned. I'm not sure where that term comes from, but it is still the same thing. It uses alum for the process. This one's been dyed a burgundy color. And it makes a very strong leather. Like I said, it's very dense. It does have some flexibility to it. So it's not entirely soft like a chrome tan leather. But it's the entire thickness of the hide might be compressed all the way into this rather than be real thick like a vegetable tan, because those fibers haven't plumped up. They've stayed in tight and close next to each other. So you've got a lot of density to it and a lot of strength. It's used a lot for bootlaces and anything that needs a lot of durability. Saddle strings, some bags and pouches will occasionally, you'll see it from it, but not often, because it is a little bit more pricey than using a vegetable tan, and especially more pricey than using a chrome tan leather for those things. But like I said, where it really excels is in making lace and in making very strong laces. This 1/2 inch lace, there's no way in the world I could figure out how to break it unless I had a bad spot in it. Even slicing it down very thin, like this here, is probably, it's less than 1/8 of an inch. So for anybody out there that's paying attention, it's actually just a little bit wider than a 1/16 of an inch. About 2 millimeters in width. And that is enough that I can't break it. I can't pull it and break it at all. So it's a very strong leather for leather laces. As a matter of fact, when I have a pair of bootlaces that break, this is my kind of go-to that I really like. I had an alum tan side that for years I cut laces off of, and found out I could get another one. That's partially why I bought it, is because I used for years. I cut laces and things out of it that I would stitch things together, like an archery quiver. Several archery quivers got stitched together with it. As I said, I replaced a lot of bootlaces with it. I would just tie things together, bundle things with it. It's very good leather for anything like that. It is not something you can tool and stamp on. And in a way, it actually functions more like rawhide than like a tanned leather. And that's because that chrome tanning process, like I said, it's a water-soluble material. So you could technically wash the chrome out, or the alum process. You could technically wash the alum out of the hide. So a lot of times, again, this will be oiled. And these are lightly oiled, and that's why it's kind of got that yellowish color to it, as opposed to the white that comes from naturally from the alum tanning. But I will oil it and finish it whenever I make something out of it to protect that lace in case it gets wet and stays wet, that it doesn't start to disintegrate when you're braiding or tying knots with it. Just like with this, I'd either put a lot of oil and waxes on it, which is what I did with this one, or I would wet it down and soak it in water for a little bit and then tie the knots in it and get it to shape and form a little bit better, because it is a pretty stiff leather, as I said, kind of dense. That's another way that it's kind of like working with rawhide. It'll work best wet. But the oils and waxes really give it a nice look. It's a nice rich color to it, even if it's a little bit lumpier, but it still feels fairly soft. Mostly rounded edges. Probably doesn't shape and form as well as vegetable tanned leather, even when it's wet or when it's oiled. Definitely not as soft as a chrome tanned leather would be in the same situation, but it makes a very durable type of lace. So that's kind of the basics of exactly what I was talking about with different types of leather. It should be mentioned that for some of the people that get really pedantic about leather, that there's some things that they sort of argue with, like alum tanning not being a tanning process is one of the things you'll hear. They'll refer to it as tawing, T-A-W, the leather. The same thing with just oiling the hides. For brain tanning will be referred to sometimes as tawing the hides. Instead of actually preserving it, it's a term that means that it wasn't tanned, it was just oiled up or something and left to where it could be tanned later, but it's kind of preserved for now, but if it got wet, it might rot. Now, again, like I said, once you start oiling and waxing this, you're tanning it with the oils, and you are preserving it then. So that argument is a little bit off because it depends on what you do with it from that point on. Again, like I said, there's leather nerds out there just like everything else, and some of them get a little upset about certain things. Now, I've mentioned also the thickness of leather a lot in various videos. I'll talk about ounces of leather and what the weight is in ounces, and that's terminology that's, I know, used mostly in the US. I'm not sure about the rest of the world. Of course, most of the rest of the world does things in metric, and we'll refer to it in millimeters. But an ounce of leather is standardized in the US to 1/64 of an inch. So 1/64 of an inch is 1 ounce. The magic number to remember is 8. 8 ounces of leather is 1/8 of an inch. It's all eighths all the way down. 8/64 and so on. From there, you can usually convert and figure out what you're doing. You can, of course, take a caliper or something and measure it. Usually you don't want to measure right at the edge of a hide. When you get a side of leather and you lay it out, if you measure just right at the edge of it, that's usually compressed on the edge as they were polishing it when they were doing that currying step I was talking about. So that might be a little thinner right along that edge than it is if you reach in from the hide a little bit. So there's special tools that are supposed to reach in and measure further into the hide. Most people don't have them. A leather store might or might not. But for the most part, it'll be marked, it'll be sold from the tannery and split, and they'll have an idea of what the thickness is. And once you've worked with it a little while, you just start to recognize them. So the conversion, like I said, that I use a lot, I like 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch is about 3 millimeters, so I can then convert to the metric on things as well pretty easily. So yeah, 8 ounce, 3 millimeters, 4 ounce, about 1.5 millimeters. And you can go back and forth through there. This alum tan leather I'm cutting into lace is I think 5 to 7 ounce. It's got a bit of range to it. So that is in that kind of 2 millimeter range that most of it's going to be in thickness. This one's almost up to 8 ounces. It's almost 3 millimeters thick. Not quite. We're going to call it like 2.75. Just a little bit shy. So that's probably close to that 7 ounce right there. So there's going to be some variation on this lace. But it is, like I said, a very strong material. It'd work well for saddle strings. And it, of course, it worked very well for these knots and braided handles, which is what I sell most of this wide 1/2 inch lace for. And there's not many other people selling 1/2 inch lace. So that's going to be available very near future on our Etsy shop. And at least now my sister's going to know what I'm talking about because I made her a video so she can tell. Anyway, that's a real rambling sort of basic leather knowledge for people out there that don't always know what I'm talking about when I just randomly say these terms.